This is Environmental Science 2, Chapter 13, Part 1 on population growth. In this portion of the video lecture, we will be taking a look at how populations change in size as well as growth rates. The human population has shown a lot of rapid growth overall by the mid-21st century, so by the year 2050. Scientists estimate that we will be around 9 billion people. As of today, in 2017, our current population is already over 7 billion. So how do populations change in size? Well, we can add individuals by either birth or immigration, which would be individuals moving into a population. Of course, subtracting those individuals out, death would be one of those, as well as emigration. So that's organisms moving out of the populations. So a population grows when the number of births and immigrants is greater than the number of deaths and emigrants. So as long as there are more births and organisms coming into the population than there are organisms that are dying and leaving, the population will grow. The rate of that can be different depending on the number of births and immigrants versus the number of deaths and emigrants. There are a lot of species that produce more offspring than will actually survive. Lots of species, for example, frogs and fish and insects, they lay thousands of eggs and spawn those, and in hopes that a few of them will make it to adulthood to actually survive. We call that overproduction. So many species overproduce. If there were no limits to population growth, we would be overrun by those overproducing organisms. Insects, trees, fish, bacteria. Those types of organisms, because they overproduce, we would be overrun with those. There are limits to population growth, however. The biotic potential is the maximum growth rate for a population. Very few populations ever permanently reach a biotic potential. It is a possibility for a short time that every individual in that population can grow to adulthood and they reproduced at their maximum. So that's what biotic potential is. If every single locust that ever lived produced as many individuals as it could possibly do in its lifetime, that's what we call biotic potential. Population growth is often modeled by a J-curve graph. That J sort of shows exponential growth. Human populations, since we have at least had recorded evidence of people living on the planet, has grown exponentially. There were very small human populations in the beginning of our history. As we have grown over the last few centuries, and especially the last two in particular, we've exponentially grown in a very short amount of time. So that J sort of represents very rapid growth. If every person that was ever born got together with another person and reproduced the absolute maximum amount of children that they could have within a reproductive lifetime, we would also be overrun on the planet with human beings. Right now, we are about at 6% of our biotic potential, mainly because there are limits to population growth. Populations just can't keep growing and growing and growing. So there are limits to population growth. Within the ecosystem, there is limited supplies of food, water, shelter space, also mates. As the population grows, if you have more members, then more members are going to need to consume more resources. And if the ecosystem or the habitat can only provide so much, then some of the members of the population will not survive. We call those resources that limit a population's growth a limiting resource. So when you have more members, you're going to have more competition. So as survival becomes more difficult, as you have to compete for those resources, population growth often slows down. Environmental resistance is an animal's way of overcoming the combined effect of all of the factors that limit population growth. So environmental resistance opposes biotic potential. So there are only so much food, space, shelter, and mates for organisms in a population. And those members that can overcome all of those limits and still be successful, they have environmental resistance. So as biotic potential, that maximum reproductive rate, increases, environmental resistance will decrease. Now, the ecosystem itself can only hold a maximum population. Within every habitat, okay, in a forest habitat, there's only so many resources available in that habitat. And those resources can only support so many different types of organisms. So we call the maximum amount of population that the environment itself can support for a long period of time, we call that the carrying capacity. And we abbreviate that with the capital letter K. Populations can occasionally go over the carrying capacity, but they do not do that for long. If in this particular little forest here, we have a very wet and rainy season, which provides a lot of plant material for those herbivores. The herbivores are going to have a buffet and they are going to eat themselves crazy. If they have enough food resources, they will be able to produce more offspring that can successfully mature to reproduce themselves. But eventually there's going to be too many herbivores for the amount of plant material that's available. The carnivores, for a while, because of the overpopulation of herbivores, they will also eat themselves silly. But eventually, remember we talked about food webs. And if you take one of those members out of the food web, that web in certain areas can collapse because the animals and the plants in the ecosystem are reliant on each other and are connected. So populations can occasionally go over carrying capacity, but limiting factors will knock the population back down. Populations will go up and down or fluctuate in response to environmental changes and the availability of resources. So basically, limiting factors can be biotic, which means they're living resources. So things like the amount of biomass in the ecosystem available to predators. And it can also be abiotic, so different types of environmental changes, things like a drought or some type of natural disaster, a landslide or a mudslide that causes physical changes to the habitat. That can also keep populations in check so they don't grow indefinitely. This has been Environmental Science 2, Chapter 13, Part 1 on populations.